So you may remember that in this debate in the Senate about whether or not to annex the Philippines, there was this concern over bringing more alien people into the United States. And that seems kind of odd for two reasons. One, of course, is very racist. But the other reason that is what I'm going to kind of explore is, wouldn't making the empire bigger in terms of population, wouldn't that make you stronger? I mean, even if these people are different, I mean, they can still make your country stronger, right? By expanding the empire. So to kind of understand that and how it's going to be connected to so-called scientific ideas of racism, there's some things we need to talk about, right? And this is going to connect into this also, this idea of this kind of new science. So remember, in the 19th century, there is a rise of nationalism. There's this idea that by mobilizing your people, by getting people to identify with their country, with their nation state, that will make the nation state stronger. Remember, Germans who are willing to send their gold wedding rings to the government in a time of war will make that government more powerful. Koreans who are willing to donate gold to their government to help it get out of the IMF crisis, as it's so called, that will also make their country more powerful. And one thing that is a part of that you can see, I think is interesting, is the rise of compulsory free public education. This is connected, right? We often think of education as being something that exists to help the student, primarily in terms of self-actualization and learning what you're good at and what you like and so forth. But by 1870, most Western governments had at least free primary education. The Japanese would add it in 1872. We'll talk more about them later. They have fascinating history. And there were two major reasons. One was to teach the skills necessary for participating in an industrial economy. Workers have to be able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. And of course, managers need to have those skills so they can develop further education down the road and further develop their skills. In addition, schools taught nationalism. They taught you your country's history. This is the history of our country. And a lot of times the history of our country is actually development of itself as a nation state. So they're teaching nationalism. And if you think that may seem kind of odd, well, if you're an American student, how do you start the day? Pledge of Allegiance, right? So it's understood because of the ideas of democracy and nationalism and liberalism and so forth, there's this idea that you can mobilize your people for national power. And the quality of the population affects national power. So what I mean by that, if you have a population that is educated and so can participate in an industrial economy, and if you have a population that is nationalistic, that is loyal to the country, that's willing to sacrifice for the country, that makes your country stronger. And people who are a part of your country, though, who are alien or unfit, they're not able to be high quality. They're not able to learn. They're not loyal. And therefore, they are not either not contributing to the country, or they might be a threat to the country. They might be a threat to the country. Now, in order to get to a deeper understanding of this fear over so-called alien people and how it's going to affect how people are going to think about race in the 19th and 20th centuries, and this is going to get really important as we continue on with this class, we need to talk about some biology. And I have to stress, I'm not a biologist. I'm going to do my best here to discuss the theory of evolution, particularly how it impacts history and how it leads to science not simply being optimistic, but also leading to fear. So first of all, the man who, in a sense, develops the theory of evolution, however you want to put it, is named Charles Darwin, an English scientist, who will argue that higher forms of life evolve from lower forms of life over long periods of time. And the mechanism by which this works is that beneficial traits allow an individual to survive and reproduce. And those traits are passed on to children. So to give you an example, let's say you have like a cat, and the cat is really fast. That cat is more likely to catch mice and eat and avoid being eaten by wolves, right? You have a cat that has a beneficial trait, the ability to run fast. It's more likely to eat and so survive, and able to avoid being eaten and so survive, and it will survive and then reproduce. and those traits will then be passed on to its children. Right? Very simple idea. And this is kind of connected to some positive, optimistic ideas because there's this kind of notion of progress built into this. Now, I'm oversimplifying things, and I'm focusing more on a popular understanding of Darwinism. Charles Darwin's own perspective was much more complex. But you can see there's this idea of progress here, right? Higher forms of life evolve from lower forms of life. Animals are getting faster, they're getting stronger, they're getting smarter because ones that are stronger, faster, smarter are better able to survive and pass those traits on to their children. So this has a positive, optimistic perspective. But there's also kind of a negative perspective too, something that makes it seem pessimistic. First of all, it challenges traditional religious views of human origins and ideas of a moral universe. Because in a sense, Darwinism is saying, well, where did human beings come from? Well, we weren't specially created by God. We just evolved from other animals from a previous time period. So we're not as special, right? We're not as special. We're not like this separate creation that God makes. We're just higher forms of animals. In addition, the traditional view is that, God, out of love, created Adam and Eve, for example. So you have a loving God. Here, there's no longer a moral universe. What determines whether what in a sense determine things is the law of the jungle. The strong survive, the weak are food, the weak die out. So this isn't a moral universe governed by a righteous, by a just, by a loving God. It is a kind of immoral, or I should say amoral universe in which the strong survive and the weak die. Or as they would say in the Chinese translation of this, which I think is really cool, is the elite eat and the weak are meat. Right? So on one side, this is positive and kind of optimistic because it seems to say things are getting better, we're having progress, but there's also some fear because this challenges human beings' place in the world. We're not special anymore, and the world, instead of being governed by a good, just, loving God, is governed by the law of the jungle, eat or be eaten. And so if humans are just like any other animal, can't we apply Darwin's ideas to human societies or races? So we're going to have the rise of what's called social Darwinism. Now, this is very, very, complex and very controversial. This question of how much Darwin's ideas connect to social Darwinism, I'm not going to go into that. But what I want to stress is that some people said, well, Darwin says that, this is how things develop. This is how progress happens. This is how evolution works. Can't these theories be applied to human societies or human races? If human beings developed from lower forms of life, from other animals, then it follows that we are governed by the same laws that govern animals. Right? We're just animals like any other animal, merely really advanced ones. So let's apply the laws of evolution to human society. And that's what we call social Darwinism. And you can see, again, this kind of idea of social science, right? That's what we've been talking about previously. Psychology, sociology, economics are all efforts to understand the laws governing human behavior in various ways. And they were inspired by natural science. This is the same sort of thing in a way. Right, we're going to apply evolution to human society. And there's this really interesting guy named Francis Galton. And Galton, he was really brilliant at coming up with names and ideas and terms to make complex ideas simple. So for example, the concept of survival of the fittest, Darwin doesn't actually say that. Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, by the way, he was a maternal cousin, that's why he's a different family name, but he was Darwin's cousin, he's the one that coined the phrase survival of the fittest. Right? He took a complex idea. If you've ever read The Origin of the Species, it's complex, and made it simple. You may have also heard of the nature versus nurture debate. Are human beings, is our behavior caused by our genetics, by how we're born, or is it caused by how we're educated? He came up with those terms. He also came up with the idea of eugenics. Eugenics literally means, the U means good, the genics means good birth, like Genesis, the beginning, like in the Bible, Genesis, beginning or birth. So eugenics means good birth. His argument is that we can improve society by improving people. By understanding the idea that we human beings are like other animals, that we are evolving like other animals, we can, because we're so smart, we can guide human evolution, right? Animals kind of evolve randomly in a sense, right? They don't have rationality. They can't guide their own evolution. But we human beings, we can build a better society by improving people, by guiding our own evolution. That's eugenics. And he comes up with the idea of this. Now, he was English, but his ideas will quickly spread to the United States, and we will become a center of eugenics. Now, there are two kinds of eugenics. One form of eugenics is called positive eugenics. So you may ask yourself, well, how do you guide human evolution? Well, positive eugenics seeks to guide human evolution by encouraging the fit to reproduce. Are you smart? Are you athletic? Are you in good health? You are? Good. You need to have lots of kids. You need to have lots of kids. Now, I have to be careful here because one thing I should point out, you have to be very careful when you compare anything to the Nazis, because it just completely, because the Nazis are just so terrible, it just completely, what can I say, torpedoes anyone you're trying to compare them to. But you maybe are saying, wow, this sounds a lot like the Nazis, and you would be right. And to give you an example, the Nazis, actually, if you were a good German woman of the right racial pedigree and right genetics, I shouldn't say genetics, but if you were a German woman who was considered to be of good German stock, you were encouraged to have as many children as possible, and you were given a medal. And it was almost like the Olympics, because at a certain number of children you had, you got a bronze medal. If you had even more children, you had a silver medal. And if you had the most children, you had like a gold medal. That's an example of positive eugenics, right? We're going to reward these mothers who are having lots of kids with honor in order to encourage these fit people to reproduce. And here's another example. They're not as big, but they still exist. But there's these things called state fairs, which is, are kind of interesting because they're, you go there and you eat lots of yummy fair food. But also state fairs were kind of centers for disseminating knowledge, like especially agricultural knowledge, and also just displaying new kinds of technology and things like that. And one thing they had in order to encourage kind of positive eugenics was they had what they called better baby contests. And they had these contests in which people would have their babies compete to see like whose baby was the best, which essentially was just doctors measuring the baby, seeing how healthy they were, weighing them. Chubby babies are good babies. You want your babies to be a little chubby because when babies get sick, they quickly lose weight. And they would say, aha, yes, you've had a good baby. This is a very healthy baby. You should continue having babies, right? That's kind of the idea of positive eugenics, right? We're going to encourage people who are healthy, who are smart, who are athletic, whatever, moral. We're going to encourage them to have more kids. So you may say, okay, well, that's great. That's positive eugenics. What are negative eugenics? Well, negative eugenics has connection to some of Darwin's other ideas. Darwin thought that species could also degenerate. And since we're applying the laws of evolution to human races or society, it makes sense that human beings could also degenerate. And eugenicists, people who support genetics, thought that if we allow people who should not be having children to have children, then we will degenerate as a race or human society. They had different ways of understanding this. And this is what we call negative eugenics. Negative eugenics is the idea of preventing people who have negative traits from having children, right? We want to prevent people with negative traits from having children. We want to encourage people with positive traits to have children. Negative traits, negative eugenics, prevent them from having kids. And this is a sign that you could see at a state fair also. And it says quite clearly at the top, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. Right? Some people, it would have been better for us if they had never been born because they are just hurting society. It would be much better if we prevented them from being born. So to give you an example of how they would kind of spread this idea, on the left it says this light flashes every 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds a person is born in the United States. On the right it says this light flashes every 7.5 minutes. Every 7.5 minutes, a high-grade person is born in the United States who will have the ability to do creative work and be fit for leadership. About 4% of all Americans come within this class. The lesson is very clear. A lot of kids are being born, but very few of them are of high quality. We need to be careful. We need to prevent those low-quality kids from being born. We want to make sure that high-quality kids are being born because they are the ones who will be the leaders of society. and this here is, so this is kind of clearly expressing this idea that some people should not be born because their very birth, their existence hurts the rest of us, weakens our race, weakens our society, weakens our country. So how do you practice negative eugenics, right? That previous slide just explained to us why people were afraid and why they encouraged negative eugenics. How would you actually deal with this? How would you actually practice negative eugenics? And the answer is through sterilization, right? You sterilize someone, you make it impossible for them to have children. They cannot pass on those negative traits, and then everything's good. So, for example, one so-called scientist, I mean, he claimed to be a scientist, and I guess at the time he was accepted as a scientist, but as we'll see, there's serious problems with his so-called science. But this researcher, studied this woman and her descendants, a woman who he called Ada Juke. That's not her real name. He used a pseudonym to protect the identity of the people. But she's around in the 18th century, and he looks at her descendants. And he creates this kind of chart that explains that of her descendants, 92% of them had negative characteristics. Right? Negative characteristics. How does he define that? Criminals and murderers, paupers, illegitimates, sex perverts, mentally diseased. So, and the argument here is very simple. Her sterilization would have cost $150, right? It would have been very relatively cheap to sterilize this woman. And if she had been sterilized, we could have prevented murders. We could have prevented sex perverts. We could have prevented mental disease, right? Wouldn't this have been better? Right? Wouldn't this have been better for society to prevent this woman from having children? Now, a couple of the problems that rise about this, first of all, is, of course, how do you sterilize these people? Right? How do you identify and sterilize them? That's kind of an issue. Forcing people to be sterilized, that's got some human rights issues. Sometimes people were, like I said, were forced to be sterilized. Sometimes they were tricked. Sometimes there was law codes about sterilization. Another issue has to, like I said, is with the science. Eugenics is trying to basically argue that these traits are inheritable, right? And so they're trying to basically argue these traits are genetic. So if you're a sex pervert, apparently there's like a gene for being a sex pervert. Pauper, if you're not familiar with the word pauper, it means a very poor person. So poverty is like genetic. Criminals, murders are genetic. That's a problem, right? And so the one of the issues with eugenics is they're trying to argue that a lot of things that are problems are genetic, are hereditary, and the problem is they're just not. There's no gene, there's no clear biological reason why someone will become necessarily a criminal or a murderer. So that's what I mean about so-called science, right? This science is kind of junk science. You cannot just say, well, this person is descended from this woman, and therefore they have a high rate of being a sex pervert. Right? That's not necessarily having to do with descent. There's a good chance it has to do with environment or poverty or something like that. And we can fix that by dealing with the issues that cause poverty, not by preventing poor people from having children, right? By forcing them to be sterilized. So that's kind of this junk science that's attached to this. And if you're saying, wow, this sounds a lot like the Nazis, you are right. And guess what? The Nazis patterned a lot of their laws and practices off of the United States, in particular of my home state of Indiana. Go Hoosiers. And these ideas, like I said, are also going to be connected to race. There will be an attempt to basically classify human beings into races that are understood to be kind of unchanging. Race is actually kind of a fluid, fluid concept. In a sense, different ethnicities can be created. You may say, well, how do you create biology? It's like, well, no, it's not just biology. Race has a lot to do with our cultural understanding of particular biological features. So it's not like it doesn't have anything to do with biology, but it's not solely biology. But there was a tendency to argue that human beings were just classified into these utterly different biologically based races. And on the picture on the left, it doesn't look so bad. It's just all these different kinds of people, and they're presented mostly positively. But you can see on the right where there is this tendency to put these people into different hierarchies, and you can see the white person on top represented by this handsome. Basically, it's a Greek statue is what's being represented. Then you have a person of African descent, and then below you have a chimpanzee, and this is just disgusting, right? The idea is that there's a racial hierarchy here with whites on top, and then other people who are not white below them, and those people are closer to animals than whites because whites are biologically superior. So this is meant to give kind of a scientific basis to racism, and this will be used to justify imperialism later on, right? It's okay for us to come in and take over African land because Africans are essentially biologically inferior. Right, so that's the basic idea. Is this is used to add a so-called scientific, it's not scientific, it's a junk science, but it's used to bring a so-called scientific justification for racism and imperialism. So this is pretty nasty stuff. So there are other unsettling ideas too. I mean, for the most part, in many ways, science is leading, is developing, is giving people the power to do new and amazing things, right? Louis Pasteur figuring out the germ theory of disease is awesome because now a lot of people are not going to get sick because we have vaccines and so forth. So that's really cool. But there's also some ideas that will give us more power, but that are also unsettling, that force us to view the world in different ways. So remember we talked about Isaac Newton. And Newton had this idea, and in many ways it's very practical and right in a lot of respects, that there are scientific laws which are unchanging that govern a universe in a rational and logical way. Energy is energy, matter is matter, time is time, and all those things just operate in very clear, rational ways. Albert Einstein then, pictured here, will come along and challenge all that. So to give you an idea, he will come up with his theory of relativity. And I have to stress, I'm not a scientist, I'm a historian, but I'm going to do my best here. But the theory of relativity is called that because it's this idea that time, space, and motion are not constants, but are relative depending on the observer or the people experiencing things. So if I'm in one part of the universe moving at one particular speed, time will pass differently than it does for you, who is in another part of the universe moving at a different speed. So if you've ever read like a science fiction book or watch a science fiction movie where there's like someone will be gone for like what seems like a week, but in fact they were gone for like 5 years, that's a reflection of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, right? That depending on where we are in the universe, time will move differently. Depending on how fast we're moving, time will move differently. So these things that we thought are absolutes, that are unchanging, a second for you is the same as a second for me, are not. They're all relative. So that's kind of disturbing, right? Things that I thought were constant are not constant. Similarly, you may or are familiar with E equals mc squared. That's the famous formula, fairly simple formula in a sense. Energy is equal to mass times a constant, which is equal to the speed of light squared. That's what it means. Why is that a big deal? Well, that's showing how energy is equal to mass, right? Matter and energy are not completely separate things. And we can take we can take mass and transform it into energy. And it's that science that makes possible the atomic bombs, right? So what's more unsettling than this, right? That things that we thought were constants are not constants. They are in fact relative, that matter and energy are in a sense interchangeable. And by changing matter into energy, we can create a huge explosion capable of leveling entire cities. That's pretty disturbing. One thing I do want to point out very quickly is that Albert Einstein is known as this kind of like clever guy, and people always try and like come up with quotes. Half of them aren't even things that he really said in order to support their positions. I'm like, well, Albert Einstein said this, and so therefore it must be right. I want to point out Albert Einstein was not particularly nice in his private life. He had lots of mistresses and affairs, so there's a kind of a problem presenting him as this really, really nice guy. He had some problems. But one of my favorite quotes he said that is authentic is, if you can kiss a girl while driving a car, you're not paying enough attention to the girl. Right? That's one of my favorite Einstein quotes. I think it's very relevant, right? If you can kiss a girl while driving a car, you're not paying enough attention to the girl. For goodness sakes, pull over, give the girl your full attention. My wife likes that quote. I like it too. And one thing that's really striking, I think, about this new science is reason makes science possible, but scientists, in this case, a social scientist, Sigmund Freud, a psychologist, considered the father in a sense of modern psychology, will question the use of reason itself, right? In the Enlightenment, which we discussed previously, there's this view that human reason is really powerful, right? Isaac Newton, part of the Enlightenment, says, with our reason, we can really understand this world and that things are going to get even better and better and so forth. And in the Enlightenment, there's this idea that we human beings are in control of ourselves. That's absolutely essential for democracy, right? In order for democracy to work, in order for capitalism to work, people need to be able to make free choices. They need to be able to use their reason to make political or economic choices. So the Enlightenment had this very high view of human reason, democracy, political systems. This is absolutely necessary. Democracy does not make sense unless people can be reasonable. Science is based on the idea that human reason works. But like I said, Sigmund Freud is going to question this. He's going to argue that what drives human behavior is fundamentally irrational impulses, right? He's going to argue that fundamentally what determines our behavior is not choices we ourselves make, but irrational impulses that come from experiences that we have undergone that we might not even remember. Now, I have an example that in a sense is kind of silly, but silly examples I think are the best because we'll remember them, is that Sigmund Freud argued that the way that we were toilet trained, the way that we learn to use the bathroom impacts our personality to a tremendous degree. In fact, some people even argued that this would, that because toilet training is often cultural, it could impact entire cultures or entire countries. But basically, Freud argued that if your parents were too strict with you, if they punished you severely whenever you had an accident when you were trying to learn to use the bathroom, then that caused you to be anal retentive. Right? People who everything has to be exactly 100% perfect. If they put down, if you put down a fork and knife and they're crossed, they'll be like, oh, you can't do that. They'll uncross them. Right? They're like, oh no, everything has to be a particular way for these people. Right? Their clothes have to be hung up in a certain way. They have to be folded in a certain way. And it's like the end of the world if it's not done correctly from their perspective. That was caused by their parents being too strict and punishing them severely when they made a mistake while learning to use the potty. The reverse. Have you ever known a sloppy person, like a slob who never cleans up after themselves and is always dirty and just never picks up? That's the reverse. That was a person whose parents were not strict enough and who were too lenient when that person was toilet trained, so they never learned to be responsible in this way. Now, there's some serious issues with this. But this was a popular view, and it says something about human reason, right? Here, what does determine your personality is not you as a rational actor. What determines your personality is what people did to you, and you don't even remember it, right? What determines who I am is something my parents did to me when I was very young, so young I can't remember it. So I'm not in charge of myself. I am fundamentally based my behavior is fundamentally based on irrational impulses because of experiences I have had, because of what other people have done to me, and I may not even remember it. And that's a very pessimistic understanding of human reason, right? So on one side, these new sciences are unlocking power that human beings had not had before and are doing great things. I mean, vaccines are awesome. However, they're also causing problems, they're also causing questions, and they're causing people in particular to question human reason itself.